Hello and a warm welcome to all our participants to this webinar. This is the webinar by SPII in partnership with OSISA on the social protection responses in the SADC region, a review of current and future cash transfer programs in the wake of COVID-19 economic and social disruptions. We have before us an opening session. Just a quick note, there's been a small adjustment to the program and we will follow the new program as distributed. May I therefore convene and open the opening session and welcome Isobel Frye. She's the director of SPII. Isobel, welcome. Please could you give us the opening remarks on behalf of SPII?
Thank you very much. Thank you and welcome to all participants to this. It is with great pleasure that I welcome people to this conversation, although the timing is an incredibly critical one globally. As Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, we had housed the Secretariat for the SADC Basic Income Grant campaign for a good 8 years, and our friends who were part of that are part and parcel of today's conversation. In the planning for the this year's work around basic income grant, we had no idea that the impact of COVID-19 would make the topic so much more urgent than it was. So I think today's lineup is going to be incredibly interesting as we hear from across SADC regions what is happening in terms of social protection. Various of the policies, for instance, in Namibia are ones that we follow very closely. We're also hopefully going to be joined by, there we are. We are joined by a trustee of Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, Comrade Langa Zita, who's going to challenge us with some questions about beyond social protection as an initiative of recovery within the region. How are we able to use the thinking to spearhead the kinds of industrialization and reindustrialization for many of us in terms of local manufacturing to meet demand, which would be sustained through the redistribution of cash grants. So I have a presentation later where some of this will be raised. We're fortunate enough to have Tendai, who will be doing the facilitation. I want to thank Taku for coming back to SPII for us for this project. I'm falling over my own words. And Makanza as well as Sang from SPII. And I really look forward to participating. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Isobel, for we indeed concur with you that the webinar does come at a very relevant moment to amplify the campaign and the demands of a SADC basic income grant, given that a lot of governments globally are resorting to undertaking cash transfers to millions of vulnerable households who are bearing the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the current crisis, therefore, does provide an opportunity in which to push forward for the alternatives, real concrete alternatives on the failing social security systems across the SADC region. May I therefore at this point warmly welcome Christabel Phiri from Southern Africa Trust to also give us and share your opening remarks. Christabel.
Thank you so much, Tendai, and good afternoon to everyone. From the Southern Africa Trust, I would just like to extend firstly our appreciation with the warm strategic relationship we've had over the years with the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, as well as the Open Society initiatives in Southern Africa. And I think all the three organizations have been undertaking activities and work that have been building the agency among vulnerable and marginalized groups, really facilitating dialogues like this conversation we are having right now, you know, to profile the issues that citizens are facing and inserting those issues in policy processes and trying to find solutions. And this session is really looking towards that. We're looking at social protection systems, and the pandemic has really just amplified how bad our social protection systems are or ineffective. And how do we come up with and identify mechanisms to set up a basic social protection system within the region that will be responsive, and address some of the socioeconomic impacts we're facing now. But even in the future, if such a crisis happens post this COVID pandemic, what systems are in place, and how are people going to be protected? Because if we were ready, we'll then be going to be able to just upscale from this, from an effective system to be able to respond to the needs of citizens and ensure that people at least have the basic level of income security. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. This is the second series. We had one, I think, a few weeks ago, and I'm looking forward to really harnessing from the different country experiences some of the issues we can take forward and insert into specific policy processes, which will help to really come up with a mechanism and a system that will help us to address the challenges that we are facing. So I would like to say welcome to all the stakeholders, the partners, and the Southern Africa Trust is really excited to be part of this discussion and see how we can work together following this deliberation. So thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you very much to both Christabel and Isobel for opening the webinar. We did expect Depros Muchena from OSISA, although he could not join us. We do have their support. And thank you very much to OSISA in partnering in making this webinar and this work possible. We will go straight into our first session and warmly welcome MutaleWakunuma. She is the Managing Director of the Institute for Social Policy in Africa, IPSA, from Zambia. And she's going to take us and walk us through looking at from programs to systems, perspectives on welfare and local solutions. Mutale, you have 15 minutes to walk us through this discussion and conversation. You have the digital space. Mutale?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the partners that have put in time and effort to make this webinar a reality. I think this is a very relevant conversation to happen in the context that we're currently in, that is considering the COVID situation and how we respond as a region moving
forward. Mutale, I'm just interjecting here from the floor. Can I just ask Taku, with regards to the last request for a program change, whether that is something that has been communicated to the facilitator? Taku? Okay, sorry, Mutale, you caught in the middle. There was just, I'm sorry, Tendai, a request just around 2 o'clock that Langa Zita go first, just because he has to travel. So I'm sorry, Mutale. Langa, do you need to?
Yes, I sent.
Okay, sorry, Mutale, you caught in the middle. There was just, I'm sorry, Tendai.
Hello, I think we have lost Isobel a little bit, but I've heard her input. I think she wanted to point out that before we call Mutale, we may need to call Langa Zita to make input because he's supposed to leave and travel. I hope I'm correct. And therefore, Mutale, sorry if you could allow for us to let Langa Zita make an input. He's one of our board members of SPII, and he's looking at the session on the need to build reindustrialization on the back of BIG, the Basic Income Grant, social protection for building strong economies going forward. Langa, Zita, I hope you are ready. Can you hear us?
Yes. Yes, I am. I'm ready. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Please go ahead. You have the digital space for the next 15 minutes. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Tendai, and thank you, comrades and friends. I really must apologize. I tried to wriggle myself out of this discussion, but I felt that it's an important discussion. But let me just squeeze myself in. I have to travel for the next 3 hours to go and see my mom, who's not well. So my apologies for this. I thought that I would like to engage. I've been involved in this basic income grant space for some time. I think Doug will remember that we had a workshop, a Southern African workshop, about 3-4 years ago, which I was asked, I think, to open because I'm the chair of the SPII board, which I opened. So I've been, even before then, I've been associated with this discussion. For instance, the very first discussion in South Africa on basic income grant, which was published by Jeremy Baskin in 1995-96. I was part of the people that he engaged with as well, thinking about surfacing this issue in the South African space. So it's an area of work that I've been interested in, I've been participating in. Now, I'm going to be focused on the relationship between the basic income grant and the issue of industrialization, okay? Firstly, I want to say that there's no debate in my mind that the basic income grant is an idea whose time has come. So it's something that will no longer be escaped. It's something that is important. It's always been relevant, particularly in the context of Southern Africa, in which there is a pronounced fragility of popular classes. Now, I think that what is important in getting to this discussion is firstly to say that we must issue from evidence, okay? We've seen with the Namibian pilot and with other experiences in Lesotho and other parts of Southern Africa that a basic income, some grants, some cash transfers have got a positive impact on the life of ordinary people. It helps to protect them. It helps them to be able to look at other issues, the welfare of their children, school attendance, health, and many other byproducts of receiving some cash transfer. In the South African case, the child grant and the old age pension grant have been very, very important interventions that have protected millions of people of South Africa who would otherwise have been destitute. So, so the issue of cash transfers, social transfers, is a very important social protection. Is a very important intervention which states in Southern Africa and in Africa and across the world ought to be engaged with. The recent development in South Africa, in which the African National Congress, the ruling party in the country, has tabled this of the basic income grant in the light of the COVID pandemic, means that it is something now that is concrete, that there is now a committee, an NEC committee, that is looking at this thing, look at its feasibility because of the impact, the social impact of the pandemic. So it's something that in South Africa is concrete, and we're now dealing with it from a very material, not so longer an idea, it is mutated and transformed into something concrete. But then why are we talking about some basic income grant? Why is it an important thing? I think a basic income grant is relevant to us for a number of reasons. One, because Southern Africa, be it Zimbabwe, be it Zambia, be it South Africa, okay, are victims of what has been called by Arigi accumulation through dispossession. That is, the colonialism that we went through was deep and thoroughgoing and involved the comprehensive dispossession of the indigenous people. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the capitalism that came as a result of this positioned our socio-economic formations as exporters of primary commodities such as minerals, which were demanded by the global capitalist economy. So over the past 100 years, since the advent of capitalism in Southern Africa, we have found ourselves not just colonized, but playing a particular role in what one would call the global division of labor. Okay, so when we talk about the basic income grant, we must link it to this reality of our underdevelopment, which is the function of our location in the global economy. Now, as I've said earlier on, I do support the idea and the demand for a basic income grant, but the way we're presenting it has got some challenges. The first one is, we argue, as the NGOs in the sub-region, that we must use mineral-based revenues to support the basic income grant. On the face of it, this is good, but there are other questions which I think for me we need to look at. The first one, who is mining in Southern Africa? Is it the indigenous people, or is it global capital? Okay, because if we're only demanding rents, yet the actual revenues from mining are exported elsewhere, we want to we'll only look at the change, if one could put it, then there's something wrong. We should, in talking about minerals-based revenues for income transfers, address the issues of the indigenization of mining in our countries. Okay, how do we indigenize mining so that the entire value chain remains trapped into our original countries? Otherwise, we're reproducing what I call our peripheral condition. Because the reason why we're underdeveloped is because of our location in the global economy. Why are we located the way we are? Is because we're participating in the global economy as exporters of primary products, not as exporters of manufactured goods, which would be happen if we were participating in a far more transformed way. Okay, so when we're talking about basic income grant and mining, we must ask the question about the importance of relating mining to structural change, which is participating in the global economy through the export, amongst others, of manufactured products. The second important or related question is that in all of SADC, we have had dismal performance in as far as agrarian reform. Okay, so the peasants or the rural population has not been assisted since the 1960s, since the first breakthroughs of decolonization. We have not yet been able to support a flourishing rural population, a flourishing peasantry. So in the absence of this failure, okay, both to industrialize, secondly, to transform the agricultural sector, okay, we do need some measure of protection. So it is important, therefore, that we support the basic income grant, but we need to link it to the transformation of the socio-economic formation of the countries that we find ourselves in. So it is important, therefore, that the debate on the basic income grant is linked to the debate of structural change. It's linked to the necessity of developing what one would call a developmental state. Okay, we've not had developmental state in Africa that look at the importance of creating value, of creating entrepreneurs who can build cars, who can build refrigerators, who can build television, who can build computers. And that's why Africa is underdeveloped. So we cannot just look at one part of solving the problem, that is distribution. We must look also at the content of it, that is of building economies that can sustain themselves, that can effectively participate in the global economy. Now, why is structural change, which I'm arguing for, important for the basic income grant? The first one is that it will be based on manufacturing revenues. Okay. Manufacturing revenues are far more sustainable than primary production, which is, of course, has got limits. There's a limit, there's a timeline to gold, there's a timeline to diamonds. At some point, they will vanish. But manufacturing production, okay, is ongoing. That's why Japan, without any mines, remains a dynamic economy with what it doesn't have any iron, doesn't have any coal, doesn't have anything, but it's based on manufacturing. So it is, secondly, manufacturing creates what are called multipliers. That is, it's an economy that's got far more impact in the overall generation of the economy in the creation of wealth in a particular country. So it's got multipliers that can pull everyone else, that got both forward and backward linkages that can create far more space for economic development. So it is important, therefore, that we link this to manufacturing. Now, manufacturing will also be important for financial transfers because it would increase the revenue. It would, than the limited revenue we would be getting only from mining. Now, why do we need basic income grant in our countries? The first one is that we need to protect, as I said earlier on, rural economies or rural populations who are very much vulnerable, because we've not had any agrarian reform in Southern Africa to note. Okay, we've not had any. So most developing economies, okay, because they've got a limited domestic market, one of the things that they do when they evolve is to create the buying power of popular classes. You do that by land reform and agrarian reform, and we've not had any agrarian reform of note in Southern Africa. So a basic income grant is important because it protects people from that. It reinforces the buying power of the popular classes in the light of the fact that of the vulnerabilities of the socioeconomic formation. It creates extra buying power. It makes transfers from the economy to ordinary people, which can therefore have a multiplier effect as well. Now, it ensures that the most fragile, the most vulnerable are protected, therefore creates the space. If you've got a basic income grant in South Africa or in Namibia or in Zimbabwe, policymakers would know that everyone has got something to eat before they sleep. Therefore, they can focus on the real challenge, which is to transform the economy and make it dynamic. So it creates the policy space, if implemented, to achieve that. Now, coming to the strategic point of linking basic income grants to industrialization, I think the point I want to make here, comrades, is that it is important that we raise the issue of industrialization, okay? Particularly as NGOs, because our leaders in the continent and in Southern Africa have not really put their eyes onto this important thing. And as a result, they continue to reproduce us in a weaker form. So it is important that we raise the issue of industrialization, because it would be the only true sustainable liberation of the continent. Unless the continent industrializes, okay, we are just in a neo-colonial arrangement. We're just under colonialism, but this time under our own efforts, okay? So, as I'm saying earlier on, the African elites have not focused on this thing, and it's about time that ordinary people in NGOs, people like ourselves, make the call that yes, we want the basic income grant, yes, we want money from those rents. We're not saying that we want money, we do not want money transferred from the mineral rents, but we say we want that, but we want more. We want to change the structure of our economies so that we've got a broader base of the economy to draw from. So NGOs like ourselves must make the call. So it is therefore, therefore I'm arguing, comrades, that we do need the basic income grant. Yes, it should draw from the mineral inheritance that we have, but more importantly, it should also be used, draw on industrialization. It should be part of an effort to manufacture, to build manufacturing capacity in our countries, so that the grant itself is bigger, because the economy is bigger. It creates a more buying power, but it reinforces efforts for us to build the country, to build Southern Africa on a sustainable basis beyond what one would call the peripheral form. That, to me, is a challenge for us today, and that, to me, has to be the main important content of our decolonization as we get into the 21st century. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Comrade Langa, for quite an insightful input. We have two questions for you. We thought we would do something a little bit different from the program, as you are going to leave us quite shortly. So I'm going to allow to open this space just for a little bit to engage with you on your input. There are two questions that have come through for you. I think first, from your input, we certainly do agree that industrializing our region will be quite vital to ensure that we do make concrete development achievements, particularly also ensuring that there's a more equitable distribution of resources that are quite inequitable at the time. So I think the important thing, though, is that industrialization in our region seems to be a bit of a myth, with only one particular strong giant, South Africa deemed to be the strong giant in industrialization in the region, out of 14 countries. So the question is quite real. What does BIG bring that will be different to accelerate industrialization in Southern Africa? This is one. When you look at BIG does speak about cash transfers to individuals. How do you see these cash transfers initiating or triggering value addition activities at the individual level? This is a question I think that gets asked a lot by politicians when we raise the BIG. How can we make individual people that are most vulnerable begin to contribute actively to economic recovery, particularly at a time like this where we are battling with a pandemic? The second question is that financing is really crucial for the successful implementation of the BIG. So how would you see governments mobilizing resources to be able to finance the BIG? Thank you, Comrade
Langa. Thank you, Comrade Tendai. Let me start off with the first one. How would the BIG reinforce industrialization? Firstly, I'm saying that as we talk about the basic income grant, so should we also talk about industrialization, okay? That we should put more attention to it, because as NGOs, we are sometimes seriously concerned about justice issues, okay? Social distribution issues. I'm arguing that let us look at issues of economic development as well. And that as we're calling for a basic income grant, so should we also demand from the elites in our countries to industrialize, to put resources aside to build, to do import substitution, okay? To help entrepreneurs to broaden and deepen participation in the economy. So I'm making a call for that as a separate issue for the basic income grant. Now, secondly, how would the basic income grant help with this? Look, in South Africa, we had a similar discussion on the Code of the Reconstruction and Development Program in the early 90s, where we said that looking at popular needs, because a basic income grant will make demand for things like maize, things like milk, ordinary things, that ordinary issues for clothing, basic clothing, etc., etc. So it does have a potential to stimulate demand for what one call popular-based items that ordinary people need. Okay, the popular food basket. Okay, it will ensure that there's lots of demand on that. Okay, and therefore, instead of us or these things coming from South Africa, you could see a situation where there's import substitution in Malawi in anticipation of the fact that there's demand for these things. So it creates the buying power of the working class and the popular classes. So that's why we support it. But coexisting with this imperative, we are saying also that for once, comrades, the issue of manufacturing development, of industrialization, should not be the issue of parliamentarians and politicians. I'm saying this as a former MP. I was in parliament for 10 years. Okay, it cannot be monopolized by people, by members of parliament or cabinet ministers. it's something that the people of the subcontinent must demand, that we want industrialization. What are your plans? Tabulate them. So this is the first thing that we're seeing. Now, coming to financing, okay, I agree that we do have some measure of primary production in our countries, be it mining-based, copper in Zambia, gold, other minerals in Zimbabwe, diamonds in Namibia and Botswana, blah, 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 blah. Of course, we can use some of these, okay, to promote some measure of basic income grant. But that, for me, would be a half victory, okay? What we need is a comprehensive victory that would force the repositioning of ourselves from a peripheral form to a far more industrial-based form of participation in the global economy. So let's ensure that some of the resources from minerals are used. But more importantly, when it comes to the finances, is the original point I was saying, that who is running our mines? Okay, because right now we are unable, because the bulk of the profits from mining get out of our countries, because the investors are in Australia, the investors are also. Maybe it's about time we demand as NGOs that we want a SADC fund for mining. We want a SADC fund for agro-processing, that we push our leaders to bring resources together such that they can support this initiative. So I'm saying you can look at the mining resource, mining grants, but use the mining grants for two things: for a basic income grant, but also don't give up on the task that has not yet been done, which is land reform and agrarian reform. We must demand these things together with asking for a basic income grant. I see a basic income grant as a measure that protects the vulnerable, so that the actual structural transformation take place in the SADC region. So that's how I would respond to your questions, Tendai. I hope I've addressed these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Langa. I think you set a quite good start and strong start to the webinar. For all our participants that are listening, please keep questions for Comrade Langa, because whilst he may leave us just immediately after his input, there will be opportunities to still carry these questions forward in the follow-up interventions and activities that are being organized following the webinar. Comrade Langa, thank you very much. We wish you a safe journey and wish you good, strong wishes and a speedy recovery for your mother. Thank you. Allow us to go shortly into a small interlude to allow our next speaker, MutaleWakunuma, to prepare to come on board and to share her presentation. So just to give her a breath to catch up and regain her train of thought, and then we can go into the next panel of discussions. Thank you.
Okay, should I proceed? Okay,
Welcome. Hello, Mutale. I was going to reintroduce you again, just in case we have some new participants that have come on board. We want to welcome you again and warmly. Sorry for the little mix-up. I hope we didn't disturb your train of thought. I would like to welcome MutaleWakunuma. She's the director of the Institute for Social Policy in Africa, IPSA, from Zambia. She's going to look at the topic and session on From Programs to Systems, Perspectives on Welfare, and Local Solutions. Mutale, you now have the digital space for the next 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I must have misunderstood you the last time. Yeah, so basically, as I was saying earlier, it's a very important conversation to have now, considering the context and the times that we're living in. But I want to look from the perspective of social protection. I want to look specifically at how far we've come as a region in terms of social protection, where we're coming from. So we'll have a quick look back, beginning from Ouagadougou 2004 and moving on to where we are now. And then we'll just quickly look at the different programs that we have. And I'll speak briefly to the socioeconomic context of SADC as well. And then just a few perspectives on why it's important to move from programs to systems and how we do that practically. So I noticed that the speaker did offer a few very valid points of why it's important to move to a basic income grant. But let me start with just a quick maybe definition so it's clear what we're talking about when we're talking about social protection in the SADC context. The definition derives from the SADC Code on Social Security. And they recognize social protection as being broader than social security and talk about it encompassing both social insurance and social assistance interventions. I think what's important in the definition is that it talks about whether it's public or private interventions or a mix of public and private interventions as encompassing social protection as well. So when you look at where we've come from in terms of social protection as SADC, so it starts in about 2004 when in Ouagadougou, the heads of state agreed and focused on poverty and employment really, or unemployment as the matter may be, and made it a primary focus for the region. And this was Africa-wide, not just SADC. And the recognition was that we needed to have in place interventions that could help to address issues of poverty and unemployment. From there, the resulting meeting that happened was a Livingston, what is referred to as the Livingston Accord or the Livingston 1 Accord, which happened in 2006 in Livingston in Zambia. And basically, this meeting set the tone for social protection starting in the 2000s. What this meeting was instrumental for was just putting the responsibility on governments to ensure that social protection was implemented in their countries and that it would be a response to poverty and inequality in their countries. So from there, the tone was really poverty focused more than being broadly developmental. In 2007, we had social security developed by SADC. And this then defines for the region what social protection is. And that's where I drew the definition earlier on of what social protection is. And then from there on, we had countries now moving on to implement social protection based on what their capacity as a country and their financing abilities. So we have countries at this point now coming up with social protection policies, financing strategies, and all different interventions to ensure that they provide social protection to their citizenry. Beyond that, if you consider the region, so we're implementing social protection programs to respond to a particular context. In this case, it's a context of Southern Africa, right? You will, similar to other regions, you will notice that we have a range of contributory programs. These vary from country to country, but essentially almost all countries in the SADC have thriving and functional social security systems, which are contributory, meaning that they rely on contributions from members for financing and for provision of benefits. So these basically cover different types of contingencies, from disability, unemployment, maternity, survivorship, and all those other contingencies that are outlined in the ILO Convention on Social Security. And then we also have a range of non-contributory programs. Now, for non-contributory programs, these became more pronounced following the Livingston 1 Accord. These are typically tax-financed programs, so they're financed from general revenues of the state, and most of them in the region are poverty targeted, meaning that they target people who are seen as indigent or marginalized and excluded, and their primary aim is to reduce poverty and more recently also to address inequality. And then we also have informal social protection programs. So when you talk about informal social protection programs, they're referring to the traditional programs that existed in the absence of government support. These would refer, for instance, to group or family or community or trade-based systems that are informally developed to take care of contingencies that are not covered by formal social protection interventions. Now, when you look at these three groupings of social protection interventions, you will notice that, for instance, in Southern Africa, and even broadly in Africa, we've now come to see a number of similar interventions in different countries. Most of these unconditional cash transfers that are implemented to reach the poor and vulnerable. And then we have a number of cash for work programs. We have a few, very few conditional cash transfers, but most of them are also agrarian-based programs that provide agricultural support, agricultural inputs, whether in kind or monetary in form, to people that do not have, in Zambia, they refer to it as they have capacity, but they are limited in terms of the resources to invest in productive ventures. Now, with the way that social protection has been rendered, a few gaps have been identified. One is that coverage has remained very minimal, with very few people being covered, especially in Africa. In Southern Africa, also, the ILO estimates about 90% of the population in Africa are not covered by any form of social security program. And then for poverty targeted programs, we then see a number of challenges, because most of them target the poor and vulnerable, meaning that they do not reach the entire population on a universal basis. At times that tends to undermine the rights perspective or the rights thinking that should underpin social security or social protection provision. And then we also see accountability challenges within the implementation of non-contributory or tax finance social protection programs. And then lastly, because when you consider social protection programs, particularly tax finance social protection programs, you will notice that most of them do target women and children, but they haven't been conceptualized in our region in a way that they're based on the life cycle. So to provide for contingencies that will happen at different stages of the life cycle. So that does not seem to be a common trend in the region, and that is one of the big flaws of social protection programs in our context. How does that relate then to the context of COVID? Why is it important for us to consider the way that social protection interventions are designed, the way that they're implemented, and the way that they're evaluated in relation to COVID? What has happened, we find, is that most of the programs have been very reactive to situations and contingencies. So it's not based on a system that was proactively designed to provide for the different stages of the life cycle, to provide on a universal basis, and to provide from a rights perspective. So what has happened is that we have an incoherent design in the social protection systems that we have. So what we're doing is we're currently piecing together different interventions for them to respond to different stages of the life cycle. What this period provides us is an opportunity to stop, take a look back, and consider what we need to do as Africa and as SADC to ensure that our system is based on local realities, and we're responding to our context, and that we're responding to emergencies that might happen that we cannot foresee. That will have to be informed by the design of a system for social protection that is comprehensive, that is universal, and that is based on rights principles. If we do not do this, what we see is, firstly, inefficiencies within the system, because what results from having fragmented systems is that we duplicate a lot of our efforts in implementing programs. We have a patchwork of initiatives that do not speak coherently together. We have illogical and poorly financed programs, so we do not have a financing stream to tap into to ensure that programs are provided on a consistent and sustainable basis. And then also, like I mentioned, we have reactive programs that are really chasing the context rather than the context, them being fit for purpose and being fit for context. And then I've mentioned this a few times also, normatively, we then have a problem because our programs do not follow particular principles that underpin social protection. For instance, universal principles that you should provide programs on a universal basis. Why this is important is that in most cases, what has resulted from the kinds of interventions that we have designed is that we have failed to reach the poor and vulnerable themselves, who should really be on the programs, in a systematic and comprehensive way. So we have to ensure that our systems are not normatively flawed. We also have programs that are very exclusionary, that do not cover life cycle contingencies, and at most times are not contextually appropriate. I say this because when you consider the different programs that we have, most of them, because we are relying significantly on donor resourcing of the programs, most of them respond to best practices that are imported into our context and do not always fit the context. And so what we're doing is we're trying to make a program fit into our context rather than thinking from our context and thinking what solution do we need to design that will be most effective for addressing the issues that we're facing in the region. So how do we get there then? What do we need to do as a region for us to ensure that we are designing programs that are moving beyond just welfare to ensuring that they are more comprehensive and providing for everybody on a universal basis? How do we move from having programs that respond marginally to minor contingencies to them responding to life cycle based contingencies? How do we ensure that our programs and our system is rights responsive or rights based? There are a number of things that we have to consider. Firstly, SADC itself has got a context in which within which it exists. For instance, our GDP is, as SADC on average, is 721 billion. And our population is about 345 million SADC citizens. But our GDP per capita is 2,060, which is an increase from even 5 years back, for instance. But then the number of people in the region that are living below $1 a day is as high as 42% in some literature and as high as 55% in some literature, meaning that our Gini coefficient doesn't reflect very well, and there's a lot of inequality in the region. When you look at inequality, we see it within countries and between countries, meaning that there are some giants. I think this was mentioned earlier also, where you have South Africa being a giant in terms of its GDP, and other countries that have got smaller GDP, but then also show a lot of inequality within their structure. And I think this also comes from the context that we're coming from. Our history and the colonial patterns that we inherited, we sort of continued to uphold those and created enclave societies that do not ensure that everybody benefits from the wealth of resources that we have. And therefore, that's why I'm saying we need to consider what the wealth that we have as a region, what good is that to the people of the region? How are we ensuring that everybody benefits from the wealth of the region? So that's important to consider. So now in ensuring that we respond to this context, how do we get there? We need to firstly design for SADC. We need to think local, think realistically, and ensure sustainability. We need to design comprehensively, meaning that we think the life cycle, we think universal, and we think rights-based. Other than that, we need to innovate. And I think this is where the difference will really stand. We ensure local solutions, financing solutions, linkages between programs, responsive systems, and planning well ahead. And then lastly, we need to build capacity And this capacity is at the institutional level, at the human resource level, as well as financing capacity for social protection programs. I like that that question was asked earlier on to my colleague who spoke very well about it, but we need to ensure that we have in place a financing system that is both comprehensive, sustainable, and based on local realities. And with that, I end my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mutale. At this point, we're just going to take a little bit of, I can see UhuruDempers is with us. Uhuru, if I can see you on the video, just to make sure that the screen is not completely empty. Uhuru? Thank you. At this point, we would like to go to our next presenter. I'm very privileged to call UhuruDempers to make an input. I've known Uhuru for many years. He's been a big campaigner and champion of the basic income grant, leading some real pioneering work in Namibia, the basic income grant. So it's always a pleasure to have Uhuru amongst the panelists when we speak about social protection. Uhuru, please, a warm welcome to you. You are now an independent consultant and a member of the Namibia Basic Income Coalition. Today, you will walk us through looking at the Namibia Basic Income Grant, not just as an idea, but from moving from a pilot to national uptake and the possible role of civil society in this process. A warm welcome to you, UhuruDempers. You have the space for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. May I, before I start, just take a minute and wish my compatriot, my comrade Herbert Jauch well. He's not feeling well. You are supposed to be part of us on this panel, but we, on all of our behalf, we wish him well. I wanted to just give you a bit of background about the advocacy work around a basic income grant in Namibia, briefly about the outcomes of the pilot project, and just an update on where the campaign is currently. It is a matter of fact that Namibia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. In fact, we compete for the first spot with South Africa and Brazil, and it's largely a colonial legacy, but the past 30 years of independence has also not made a significant dent on the levels of poverty and inequality in our country. There has been some progress in the delivery of some social services like education, improvements in enrollments, in health, in infrastructure, and other social services, but there has not been any interventions that structurally transforms our economies, and therefore the gap between the rich and the poor seems to be on the increase. For the past, I think, more than 15 years, Namibian civil society organizations has been advocating for a comprehensive social protection program, including a basic income grant. This started off with a report that was commissioned by the then Minister of Finance in 2002. This panel of experts, which were both national and international experts, looked at the Namibian social protection framework then and recommended, in order to have a bigger impact, the introduction of a universal unconditional basic income grant. They proposed that it be from 0 to 59 years so that it can be linked to the already existing and very successful old age grant program. After this report was tabled in 2002, we were with a lot of excitement waiting for government to roll out this proposal, but we realized quickly that there was need for a push from outside, from civil society, and came together convened by the churches in Namibia and launched the Basic Income Grant Coalition, which became the largest civil society movement in Namibia at that time. We lobbied and advocated and launched a number of initiatives to convince government, quoting examples from Latin America, from Asia, and so on. There were not a lot of pilots happening or experiences in Africa at that point in time. But then we realized that every time there was a critique that these examples were not local, the context might be different, and all kinds of excuses. And therefore, we in January 2007 decided to launch the pilot project in the village of Ochivero, Omitara. I was privileged to be part of this pilot from day one, and I can say that it didn't just have positive impact on this village, it had a transformative impact on this village. We're giving each citizen living in this village 100 Namibian dollars, and then the households will pool together this 100 Namibian dollars, and there was, I think the largest household there was about 12 people in a household, so they would have an extra income of about 1,200 Namibian dollars, and then they would sit down and plan and see how they can sustain themselves. But they had a guaranteed income for about 2 years, and they could plan their lives around that. The results were overwhelming, and we also, to make sure that we carefully monitor and that the objectively monitor the results, we also put together an international panel, a reference panel, that will look into the results that were being produced. A lot of the results were not necessarily kept by the coalition. It was the police would tell us the crime rate has drastically came down. A lot of it was economic crime, illegal poaching by the villagers in the adjacent commercial farms, which, by the way, is actually their ancestral lands, but due to our past, it's now owned by a small white minority and also some absentee landlords. We saw a lot of economic activity. One shop owned by a white man, we saw in a few months people in the village establishing small spasha shops and what we call kuka shops and so on, and selling food products and needs. We saw job creation taking place, barber shops, shoe repair shops, all kinds of grocery shops and so on coming up in the household. The white farm owner was even complaining that people are no more coming and buying from him, not knowing that people were now having their own businesses. The impacts on education was overwhelming. The school even had to build 2 extra blocks so that those that were on the farms could come and enroll their kids. At the health, the malnutrition rate came down and even was better than the national rate of about 30%. The malnutrition rate came down. The visits to the clinic was telling us our income was about 250 a month. With the basic income grant, they were getting more than 1,300 Namibian dollars. On every level of society, we saw lots of improvement happening. And after 2 years, with the evidence that we had, we thought that we could convince our government. We invited members of parliament, all decision makers were briefed about the results and so on, and we were very optimistic. But again, the forces within government that were opposing the basic income grant had the upper hand, unfortunately. We continued with the advocacy and lobbying campaign. We also joined international forces. We were really surprised that this small pilot that we did in Ochivero became an international reference center, and that this village, the experiences from this village actually translated in a lot of masters and PhD degrees. We had film crews from almost all the continents coming to visit this village. We had the UN, we had other international bodies coming in and looking at the experiences of this village. So it really had a transformative impact. We, in 2015, were very optimistic when our chairperson of the Basic Income Grant Coalition was made the Minister of Poverty Eradication and Social Welfare. We thought it was a done deal that the Basic Income Grant was going to be implemented, because one of the, I think the motivations for the president to appoint him was because of him campaigning for this basic income grant, and we realized that we probably celebrated too early, and we still do not have today a basic income grant in Namibia. We now, before Cabinet, have a draft social protection policy that is proposing a universal child grant from 0 to 18 years. And then we still have the universal old age grant. So we are grappling with the in-between, the 19 to 59 years. And there has been a number of proposals, and we have reactivated recently our campaign for the basic income grant, and we have proposed that there be a grant introduced for this age group of 19 to 59. We think with the current resources that Namibia had before COVID and so on, we could have afforded even 1,000 Namibian dollars for that age group. But with the realities of COVID and job losses and all that, we think we can compromise for about 500 Namibian dollars at least per month for those citizens in that group. And then we will have realized our dreams of a universal basic income grant. We still are grappling with the debates about universal versus targeted. During COVID-19, we had the emergency income grant, which was very quickly rolled out by government to respond to the challenges posed by COVID-19, where 750 Namibian dollars were paid to all those that are unemployed, that are outside of the income tax bracket, and we saw about 800,000 Namibian dollars paid out to citizens in those categories within a matter of a month. So we feel that the capacity is there from within government, even with the current resources, to be able to roll out a basic income grant. There's really, if you look at the tax-paying population, we're talking about, in Namibian context, about less than 200,000 people that are actively paying for income tax, and we feel that excluding this small population and putting up all kinds of bureaucratic mechanisms and structures and costly processes, we could, as was suggested by the NamBIG Commission in 2002, include even those ones, and then through the tax system, make adjustments to make sure that those that in the high income category do not necessarily benefit, but they kind of subsidize and sort of in a sense of solidarity pay for those ones that are at the end, at the receiving end of income. We have also proposed that we reprioritize the national budget, that there's some wasteful expenditure. There's recently a lot of allocations that is going to Ministry of Defense, which we cannot understand. We're proposing a levy on access on natural resources, minerals, fish, and so on. You have heard about the fish rot scandal that has rocked our country recently. It's only then that we realized how much income we actually could potentially make from fish resources, marine resources. We are also saying the tax collection can be improved. We don't believe that only 200,000 Namibians are eligible for tax. There's a lot of evasion taking place, introduction of a capital gains tax and inheritance tax, and increase of the tax for high income groups. We're also proposing that if this grant is introduced, the food bank that has been piloted the past few years should be done away with, so that people can use some of those resources that they get to buy food for themselves. So we have had engagements with the Ministry of Poverty Eradication, Gender and Social Welfare, and we are hoping that soon Cabinet will express itself on the proposals that we have made, and hopefully the current realities of COVID will bring our leaders to the realization that it's not a matter of if we must have a basic income grant or not, but that it is a necessity that we must have a basic income grant, and also combined with other interventions in land reform, in housing, and other issues that are placed by introducing this. So I think I could end here and just say that we are again at a point where there's a lot of anticipation that finally a basic income grant could become a reality in Namibia. We have experienced it in this village, and we have living testimonies from people from this village how transformative the basic income grant can be on their lives. There's people from Silicon Valley are talking about the basic income grant. Even many billionaires in the world are talking about the basic income grant. I hope our leaders listen to us carefully this time, and that we will soon be rolling out a basic income grant in Namibia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uhuru. And thank you for sharing the news with us about Comrade Herbert. He's such a dedicated comrade in the struggle for social justice. Please share with him our well wishes for a speedy recovery.
Will do.
Okay, allow me to prepare us to go into the next presenter session. I think one of the highlights of the COVID-19 pandemic in the Southern African region has been how other SADC countries have looked to South Africa for not only determining or outlining what the COVID lockdown conditions and restrictions, but almost following the exact template that South Africa outlined. But there was also a marked reference by a lot of SADC governments to South Africa's approach to social protection during the pandemic that still remains ongoing. Not only within Southern Africa itself, but global comparisons were being made. South Africa was being applauded to responding quite promptly and quite, not sufficiently, if we can't use that word, but quite robustly to providing social protection to the most vulnerable groups in society. So it's with interest that we see Isobel Frye on the program, trying to give an assessment of this in her presentation and trying to respond to a question that we always raise, that can a universal basic income grant be built incrementally? And to look at the politics of pragmatism through South Africa's COVID social security response. At this point, please may I invite Isobel Frye. She's the director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, SPII, to walk us through this conversation. Welcome again, Isobel, to this space. You have the space for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thanks again. It's been fascinating hearing the different inputs, which have been extremely helpful, and it's good touching base with comrades from previous times. I also just want to apologize in advance. I'm going to be losing power for load shedding at 4, so I hope to be finished before then. But I will come back in once we've been pushed out on the electricity grid. So while we're talking about future visions, we live with current realities. So I have my presentation on the screen, and if I do come up against any technical hitches, if someone could let me know. Thank you. So let me just hide myself there. So I'm going to be talking, as Tendai was talking about, and as some of the questions in the chat are focusing on the context in South Africa. For many people, the issue of incremental increases, universalism by stealth, as it were, is a tactical question that we've toyed with for a long time. And I'll just paint where we are in South Africa and why, although going down the incremental path, it is not necessarily guaranteed to be a successful path towards universalism. So just to share with people that in South Africa, we have a constitutional right to social security and social assistance, subject to progressive realization within the state's available resources. What we've seen since 1994 is a rollout of cash transfers or social grants to 18 million people out of our roughly 57 million people living in South Africa. So that was prior to COVID. That includes old age pensions for people over the age of 60, as well as child support grants to the age of 18, disability grants for people living with disabilities. There is a category of foster care grants, but that's quite a minimal one, and a few others. But the majority of grant recipients receive the child support grant, which is about 13 million children, though it's received by a caregiver on behalf of the child. These grants are all means tested, so they are conditional as well as categorical. We do not have any social assistance for working age people through the Social Assistance Act. So that's 18 to 59-year-olds, but similar to what Uhuru was saying for people in Namibia. The basis being, of course, that full employment means that working age people don't require any additional income support. However, since the 70s, which is really when or 50s to 70s, which is when the Social Assistance Act has its roots in terms of social policy, the full assistance there, the full employment there is not mirrored today in South Africa. In the first quarter of 2020, we saw an increase in the expanded unemployment rate to 39.7%, which is roughly 12 million. So they were formerly unemployed. And in April 2020, which is when we did a large national survey, 3 million additional people had lost their employment. And that, of course, is set to skyrocket as the impact of the economic lockdown and social lockdown of COVID took place. So to come to the discussion around universal basic income in South Africa, as previous speakers have said, this is not something which is just parachuted into South Africa at the time of COVID. In 2002, we had a ministerially appointed committee of inquiry that came up with a report known as the Taylor Report, after the chair, Professor Vivian Taylor. And as one of its central pillars of comprehensive social security, a recommendation was a universal basic income grant. Now, there were about 12 input reports that went into the committee specifically on a basic income grant. A lot of financing and funding modeling was done at that point in time. And the inputs ranged from a value-added tax idea to income tax increases, solidarity tax. We've also, at the time, we did a couple of additional financing and econometric studies. In fact, people who assisted in the Namibian Basic Income Grant were part of that committee as well, as part of that secondary research. So the point is that I think it's fair to say that there has never been a lack of research around basic income. this is what the Namibian pilot also suggested. Many people, when they're trying to not respond to a question of basic income, say, oh, we should do more research about it. We really researched this question to death. And yet what we see, the second bullet point there, is that in South Africa, there's always been a lack of appetite from the ruling party and the state in terms of adopting basic income grant. There have been a number of reasons for that. I think at the heart of it is a lack of ideological certainty. So although this ANC talks about being a social democratic state, a party, it isn't really articulated in social policy. There's also a wealth of orthodox economists who sit in government, in National Treasury, as well as the South African Reserve Bank. And although we've seen failing economic policy since 1994, for some reason, what they say takes more weight than the wealth of evidence, both nationally, regionally, and globally around certain things, including a basic income grant. So what we are seeing is that there have been formal social dialogue investigations of the option of a basic income grant, again, as part of a comprehensive social security system under NamBIG, the Social Security Task Team. And I represent community constituency with other collegiate organizations in this task team. The task team has been meeting since 2012, and we're still looking at research. There is basically a complete inertia of political will. We see that social policy coming up against economic policy. So we've had people recommending that it would be a useful policy, but there's also a complete refusal from people with the National Treasury to endorse it as something of serious conversation. I'll come back to that in a couple of slides' time. So just again to reflect on what's happened since the introduction really of the COVID-related social and economic lockdown. What we had was an announcement by the president of the lockdown. We had a hard lockdown for the first 3 weeks in which people were not allowed to work, were not allowed to leave their houses. What we've had since then is a gradual loosening of some of those restrictions, but there was a serious impact on critical areas of the economy and specifically on informal traders who for many weeks were not allowed to trade. The question that we raised was, if people are going to be denied access to their income generation, they need to be compensated. A lot of the formal economy employees are covered by unemployment insurance, and a number of weeks of our negotiations were about how you expand that to people in atypical situations in terms of lockdown and COVID, and yet there was very little attention given to people who are not part of the formal situation. So we were very pleased to hear an announcement by the president of part of a national stimulus package, an expansion of social cash grants to a number of categories of people. So in addition to a top-up of all existing grant recipients, there was an additional amount which was given to caregivers of children in receipt of a child support grant, and I'll come to that now. But also a new revival of a category of grants which was on the statute books, known as social relief of distress, which had really been used for emergency funds for fire, victims of fires, etc., but was, in terms of the Act, is possible to be a vehicle for cash relief for people in distress. And I notice that there is someone from SADC on this, and it's really great that you are here. I think that SADC faced a number of administrators. SADC is the South Africa Social Assistance Agency, Social Security Agency, sorry. And that processes the grants for grant recipients. So there were many concerns about the delays of SADC in putting people on the books, in registering applicants for social relief of distress. And there were technical glitches which took a number of months of critical time, which delayed the receipt of cash relief by many people. I think the concerns that we had as well was that in terms of the policies made by policymakers and not by SASA, there seemed to be errors of exclusion rather than any errors of inclusion. So there were a whole list of people who were not eligible. So the first, of course, was that you were not earning income. The second was that you were not in receipt of unemployment insurance, that you were not a government employee, that you were not receiving any other SASA grants, and none of the NSFAS student funding. Unfortunately, a large category of people who had received unemployment insurance in the past but were clearly outside of that were rendered ineligible by the system. So that was critical. So you can see that the lack of universal approach means that our mindset is about who is not eligible rather than trying to approach everybody from a point of view of eligibility. And that really is a critical point for us in our conversations going forward. I think the other point that was of great concern to us is that because caregivers received grants for children and received a top-up as caregivers, they were rendered ineligible for social relief of distress in their own right. The net result of that is that most of the beneficiaries of this are male. So constitutionally, that is critical in terms of the rights to equality. This is definitely indirect discrimination, but it is also, it perpetuates this, the view of women as only being caregivers and not being people who are entitled to support in their own right. The other thing is that the assistance was rendered only until October of 350 Rand per person per month. So even though there were delays in approval, it's not 6 months, it's only until the cutoff of October. So just looking at where discussions are taking place, I am taking a lot of time, sorry about that. There are discussions within the Department of Social Development at a high level, and there is quite a broad acceptance of how this would be sequenced. The DSD is leading discussions within NEDLAC, but have also been making representations to other spaces. So within the ruling party, there are two subcommittees of the National Executive Committee, the ANC Social Transformation Committee, in which the Minister of Social Development sits. And they have adopted formally the idea of a universal basic income grant. However, the Economic Transformation Committee has not. So we see that split right down the middle. Last week in NEDLAC, there was a resistance from the Minister of Finance when Community Constituency put forward the basic income grant as a point of the Economic Recovery Plan. The Minister of Finance said he wanted it to be noted on record that there is no adoption of a basic income grant. The President then came in and said that he thought it was a scheme that he was very much in favor of, and that there should be further investigation as part of a comprehensive social security system. So it was important tactically that the President didn't close the door on it, but it was just an indication of the resistance that, notwithstanding the level of complete destitution and starvation within Treasury, there is still no agreement, no willingness to engage. And we have a variety of civil society coalitions, not always talking together, but who are in support of it. So the point around one of the obstacles is the question of financing, and really around that we've seen a number of recommendations for incremental increases. So for instance, Vivian Taylor, who was the chair of the Taylor Committee, is now National Planning Commissioner, and she made a representation to us in NEDLAC on Friday. And her recommendation is that you reduce the pension age from 60 down to 55, and then a further reduction, and you introduce a youth grant. So you increase from either side in a bit of a pincer movement. Her point is that it has to be universal by 2030, which is the first time I've heard a time frame put to an incremental approach. Tendai, I can't see any chat, so if you're probably telling me to finish up, I'll just keep on going until you use your voice to say so. So I've just put in here an assessment of the incremental extension. On my left-hand side is the question of the pros. So what we've seen is that we've allowed a new category of cash transfer beneficiaries to be created, and I think that that cannot be overemphasized, how important it is to see adult working age people being on the books as being cash grant beneficiaries through the social relief of distress. It's also increased government's view of the obligations to people in face of dire poverty. There is some lukewarm reference to constitutional obligations, but that's not really that important to decision makers. We have expanded the grants payment system exponentially and captured millions of people's details, which is important, as Uhuru would say, from the Namibian experience. We've also increased people's expectations of the rights of access to social security. I don't think for the majority of people in South Africa, the question of rights has taken hold. I don't think we have enough constitutional rights education at any level within schools, but people see government as having an obligation to their well-being, and I think that this has expanded that. And there certainly has been a huge amount of public debate around middle class, chattering class people on the basic income grant. And a lot of media through the media, both formal and social media. The cons are that the current relief is time-bound, the current award of social relief of distress, until the end of October. It's a very minimal amount. So part of the point about incremental is people say that if you open the door, you can sort of open it forward. One of my concerns is that a lot of the evidence of the benefits of universal grants is that you have a multiplier effect in terms of economic stimulus. My concern is that the amount is too small for that to have a multiplier effect. We're currently in a mess about the future of grants because we've opened it incrementally on a time-bound basis, and you've got this pushback from Treasury saying it's no longer humanitarian. As I mentioned, the critical gender inequality in terms of caregivers. We've also seen a really weird response, harking back to a historic view on extended public works programs as being a requirement for sweat equity. So people need, so says Treasury, to register for extended public works in order to receive any cash entitlement. That's archaic, it's insulting, and it's incredibly costly and time-consuming to administer. The other thing about incremental is that it allows time for inertia. So 2 more slides. So the assessment is that there has been an overwhelmingly positive response from through the social relief of distress to the idea of cash grants being necessary. The third point, however, is that there are still people who think it's a waste of time to give money to the poor in an incredibly insulting and unacceptable way. There is a resistance to thinking about grassroots demand-driven economic impact. There's no thinking of the multiplier effect. And in many of our minds, and I include myself in that until we have thinkers like Comrade Langa, I've spent very little time thinking about the links between longer-term strategic reshaping of our country and our region beyond the impact of ensuring that there's redistribution through cash grants. So as weeks, days, and months go by, there is less and less urgency in using the COVID moment to expand social assistance. My view has always been that this campaign and demand must leave the chattering classes and be owned by millions of people directly affected by hunger and starvation. We also need to have the support by heads of state in both the region, the continent, and globally, as well as continental and international organizations. So the AU, the United Nations, as well as regional heads of state would be really good. One of the things the president said was that he was speaking to the head of Sweden, Prime Minister, sorry, and raised the basic income grant, and he was surprised that people rejecting it. So the Swedish Prime Minister and others, it would be great if we could see Uhuru some of the positive political endorsements going forward. And we must also never ever mistake tactics for strategy. So the temporary reforms of cash redistribution should never be mistaken for structural equitable change. Incremental should never be mistaken for universal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isobel. You were well within your time, so that's great. Okay, So a few questions have been coming through from the live stream and from the chat that's going on. I'm just going to ask all our panelists to ready themselves to respond to some of the questions. Some of the questions are direct to each individual panelist, but I will also allow other panelists to make some input or contributions towards responses, because I believe that they are all experts in this area and can help to strengthen some of the responses to the questions to each of the panelists. So if I can begin with a question for Mutale. Maybe let me just do a quick check to see if our panelists are here. Mutale, Uhuru, and Isobel, you're all here?
I'm here, thanks.
Okay, very good. So the first question is to Mutale. You gave a very profound argument that our governments often go from provide social protection through programs, and yet we should be moving from programs to systems. So the question is, what do you think are the primary reasons that Southern African governments continue to rather push poverty reduction as programs, social protection as programs, as opposed to systems? And what do you think should be the counter argument to each of these primary reasons for governments refusing to change the approach?
Okay, so thank you for the question. I think a very valid question, because indeed you should expect some pushback from when you ask that we move beyond programs to systems. I think a starting point is really the gap that the program approach presents in the way that social protection is designed and delivered. So effectively what you're doing is you're putting little drops of water in a container that requires much more than a few drops. And so what states will need to do is think more honestly about what overall objective of us providing social protection. Do we want to reduce poverty in pockets, or do we want to reduce poverty sustainably and effectively to ensure that we move the majority of the poor from poverty and ensure that everybody's livelihood and well-being is safeguarded through the provision of social protection? So one is really from the perspective of what are the objectives of providing social protection. The second would be that there's never really been any studies or evidence that shows that countries cannot afford social protection, because most of the arguments that governments present really are around resource capacity, that they do not have sufficient resources, that they cannot sustain the provision of social protection, particularly from a rights point of view. But we've seen countries like, for instance, I like to give the example of Lesotho, which decided to go against donor advice and provide social protection to its elderly population on a universal basis. And so I think what becomes critical then is the realization that this is not really about whether there's the ability of resources, but it's really a question of both political and social will in governments making sure that there's enough resources for financing social protection. And that's the reason that in my recommendations in how we get there was that we need to innovate. Now we need to innovate even in the area of financing to ensure that we have a financial architecture that will both provide for social protection in the short term and provide it in a sustainable way in the long term. I like the fact that the speaker before me had actually raised these issues. I mean, even beyond just relying on our natural resource wealth, there are other ways that we can innovate to ensure that we have sufficient resources to provide for the poor and vulnerable in our societies. And if you look at the provision that I gave for the context of SADC, it's not that we're short of resources, it's just that we live in a very unequal context in SADC. We haven't flattened the curve in terms of poverty and inequality. And that's why we have a lot of people living below the poverty line. So I think those would be two of the most fundamental arguments to present to our governments if they did push back on moving from programs to systems.
Thank you very much, Mutale. For Uhuru, the question is, what went wrong in Namibia? At some point, there was really a huge expectation that Namibia would be the big success on the basic income grant. So what really went wrong? Why did it not then become a finalized deal? And what are the key lessons or advice that you would give to other civil society organizations in the region that are trying to push for a big in their own countries? Comrade Uhuru, can you please first unmute your mic so that we can hear you? Thank you.
Yes, sorry, I got excited about the question maybe. Yeah, there's a couple of lessons that we have learned. First, that when the reports of the pilot project came out, the evidence was so convincing that we were sure that our leaders in government were also going to be impressed. In fact, some of them that we took to the village that spent a whole day visiting households just randomly and engaging with people, they were telling us there that we are going to change our minds. Even if my party disciplines me, I'm going to speak out in favor of the basic income grant and so on. But we realized that because of the dynamics within political parties, within the way our representatives are appointed and elected, the democratic processes within parties, people always think as if they owe something to the leader that appoints them, and therefore these leaders that we thought we convinced we did not really become champions for the basic income grant, and betrayed even the people that they promised that they met and promised that they were going to become their voice in parliament and other places. I remember when the former president Pohamba said in parliament that he's not in favor of a basic income grant. Why should he, the president, get $100? It will promote dependency and all that. We're expecting that there would be some voices sort of explaining and clarifying and trying to engage in a debate, but it all went silent. I think the second lesson was also when our own chairperson of the basic income grant became minister. I think we became sort of complacent. We let the guard down too early. I think we celebrated too early, and I think we should have, even that time already, continued with aggressive lobbying and advocacy and so on, and even think of some radical ways of demanding for a basic income grant. But that also did not unfortunately happen, and we only realized much later that this was a shortcoming that we have overlooked. Of course, around that time also, it was really the start that we started to experience an economic crisis, and the opponents of the basic income grant used that to indicate that yes, we would have loved to consider it, but given the realities of government income and so on, we cannot do that. But also we I think are now at a stage that with the crisis of COVID, we can't think of any other way to rescue people that have been made redundant, people that have no means of income, people that have been laid off in the tourism sector, in the aviation, in other sectors, massive job losses and so on. So it's not just an income grant to substitute income, but it's also for those that are unemployed. It would probably be for many households the only income that they would have to be able to survive. Yeah, but we have learned a number of lessons, and we have also documented the 10 years of experience of advocacy after the pilot project, and that booklet is available on the website. People can just Google 10 years of basic income grant in Namibia or 10 years after the pilot and read more of the lessons that we are drawing there. There was another question that came that I saw on the chat. I don't know whether I must respond to that now or there would be another opportunity. There was a question around the emergency income grant, how successful that was rolled out here in Namibia.
Please go ahead and pick it up, UhuruDempers. I think the question speaks to your input and suggestion that Namibia gave out a 750 Namibian dollar cash payout that was administered during the COVID pandemic as a government response. And then the participant wanted to know what have been the challenges in the implementation of this particular cash transfer. And they do make a comparison to South Africa's attempt under the Social Relief of Distress grant, which they argue from a South African perspective that it was poorly implemented. So I think you can go ahead and then present a response to that, and then we can take another question for another panelist. Thank you.
Yes. For us, the rollout was surprisingly successful. The kind of technologies that we used, the cell phone was a main element, played a major role. The applications was mainly done through cell phones, where people were there was some kind of a questionnaire sent to people, and then they could complete that, provide details about their current status, their personal details, and so on. And then this was verified against whether they were paying taxpayers, whether they were employed, whether they are receiving any other social grants from government, and so on. So when government announced this, they said they were looking at about reaching about 800,000 people. And the last time the Minister of Finance was giving an update, we had about 700,000 people that had received this grant. There was still about 100,000 people that were in a queue. Their details were still being verified, because some of them, although they have been unemployed for years, are still on the tax system as paying tax. And then some that didn't have national documents still have to be verified whether they are really Namibian citizens, and just other details around surnames spelled with clicks and without clicks, and all those kind of little details. But looking at the time frame that it was designed and rolled out, I think it was impressive how this was done. If the means testing was removed, if it was just given to everyone, it would have even been much successful, and it would have been without these glitches and these 100,000 people. Still a significant number of people, probably some of them that most needed this, were excluded. We had 2 engagements with the minister to relax some of the conditions and the there was a process opened up where people could manually approach their elected representatives and be assisted, even if they had cell phones, didn't have cell phones or didn't have national documents, but could still apply manually and get these grants. But if it was a universal grant, it would have been much more efficiently and successfully rolled out. But because of the 200,000 people that are paying for tax, we had to go through some of those hurdles, and still some people have not received the grant as we speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Uhuru. I'm going to pick up a question for Isobel. The question is in relation to your viewpoint, whether you see the push for an incremental rather than a universal implementation of the grant to actually be a potential way to lose some of the benefits of actually fighting for a BIG, including the economic multiplier effects. Do you feel that this shift is actually a failure that's materializing, or do you think it's just an opportunity or opening in space in which to begin the conversation and then push for universal implementation? Isobel, I hope we didn't lose you to the load shedding.
I mean, that's really what I was hoping to share at the heart of my presentation is I think that we've lost out on the ability to prove the multiplier effect. I think that, of course, cash relief was needed quite urgently. And in that sense, it's addressed some people's utter destitution, but it has made more acceptable the idea of giving cash to working age people, against which there was an ideological opposition previously. I don't think that it has in the immediate term taken us anywhere closer to a universal basic income grant. So I don't think, for instance, it's something that's going to be announced in October. I think in the looking at a long game, it has been positive. And as long as people who are in support of calling for a basic income grant don't give up the work, and now start going to grassroots organizations and structures and start mobilizing and doing that kind of work, then I think it's important. I think that one of the dangers that I've thought about most recently is if we have this peak of demand, government doesn't respond to it, and everything goes back to being, then you'll have those political leaders who say we don't need to do this. So until we get millions of people on the street demanding it, I think that we are in danger of people who are opposed to it saying we don't need to organize, we don't need to adopt it or implement it. So it is a critical time. And I think the balance of forces have changed. And I don't think that activists have necessarily appreciated the heightening of the demand for broad-based action that this change has brought about.
Thank you very much, Isobel. I want us to slowly start moving towards the way forward and having you as SPII speak on that in Southern Africa Trust. But I think I have one fundamental question that may help us to begin to move to the end of our webinar. And it was addressed to all the panelists. And taking into context what Isobel was saying in her own presentation in the kind of final words you just gave us now, that, on the ground, there was, if there's a need for a real swell of support and an amplified voice calling for BIG, at some point, I think there's an increasing sentiment that at some point the BIG coalition was massive. And it was a powerful movement. It was visible, it was loud. And the question is, what went wrong with the coalition? And how can it be revived? So maybe I will start a little bit with Mutale, if you can share your own perspective looking at that in Zambia. And then Uhuru, if you can also look at that again with your experience in Namibia, and then Isobel maybe in South Africa. And then we go into a few sessions to say what would be the takeaways and what would be the way forward. So I'll start with Mutale. What would be your response?
So interestingly, in Zambia, we never really got to a place where the basic income grants movement took a life of its own. I think much of the conversation was still happening at the regional level, and we were part of that movement and championing the idea of the basic income grant. Unfortunately, I think in Zambia, because of the emphasis on social cash transfers, and the arguments around resource availability, it never really became a concerted agenda for whether it's civil society or even the state taking it up. I do think there's a huge place for it now in ensuring the provision of social protection through a basic income grant, because that's one sure way of ensuring income security for everyone, and it should be championed on the basis of a universal right for all citizens of a given country. And in terms of how we go back to it, I think it's just identifying the right champions at the local level, but then also ensuring that it's very strategically linked to the regional discussion so that it has sort of a legitimacy that's coming from that level at the national level as well.
Thank you very much, Mutale. Uhuru, what would be your key inputs in a minute on responding to this particular? Hi, Uhuru. Can I ask you to also unmute yourself first?
Yes. I think I remember a few years ago when I was coordinating the advocacy campaign, we would with the people from Ochivero, from this village, would do the roadshow campaigns, would have like town hall meetings with 200, 300, 500 people attending, and people would be inspired and they would be moved and they would ask us, what next? What can we do to contribute? People were proposing for the basic income grant and so on. But when we came back with this kind of reports to the basic income grant coalition based here in Windhoek, there was always this sense that maybe that kind of action is not yet necessary, that there's still a seat for us in the boardrooms of government to try and negotiate and convince them around the implementation of a basic income grant. And I looking back, I think those were opportunities that were missed, and we sort of stood in the way of grassroots communities that were moved by what they were hearing and seeing, and that wanted to go out and express their support publicly. So I think now if the current engagements are proving to be unsuccessful, I think that's a real option to demonstrate that there is a popular support for a basic income grant. I was telling people from the Ministry of Poverty Eradication and Gender last week when we had a meeting on some study that they are still doing around feasibility of a basic income grant, which we said is really irrelevant, it's outdated. But we were saying that we can remember their national dialogues that they have in the regions. We can remember newspaper headlines, basic income grant, but these democratic expressions of citizens have not been taken on by the leadership. And I think now is an opportune time for people to be left to express themselves in different ways on social media, on the streets, in a more radical sense. I think boardroom politics is not working. It has proven to be a failure the past 15 years.
Thank you very much, Uhuru. Isobel, what would be your reaction to the question?
I think that the interesting points about NGOs involved in political work is that it seems to me that there are times when staff of NGOs see it as a job rather than being activists who are in service of grassroots movements. That for me is becoming clearer and clearer. We who have the privilege of working in NGOs should see ourselves as being support organizations for movements. And as Comrade Uhuru was saying too, with hindsight, I think that really has become very clear, and something as structural as a redistributive cash system. I think the message that Comrade Langa started with is also important. If we want to free ourselves from the colonial impact of our region, that needs to be our very clear demand. And as we move forward in COVID restructuring, that needs to be something which we talk to as the political economy, and not just the question of the sort of socioeconomic rights. I think what Mutale was saying is important, that if we cohere as a region, we need to have a much more inclusive vision. But to my mind, the use of social media would be crucial. We didn't have that in South Africa in the 2002 campaign, how we ensure that people have that passion for it. But I think the other thing that I want to conclude on, when I started in this work, my passion kind of gave it a binary. Civil society, good, government, bad. Now, and hearing Uhuru's stories about the minister as well, we need to identify those allies who are in government. There are a number of people in the civil service and the public service who are very sympathetic, and it's how we enable them to have the argument to support those decisions, so that when the outside demand comes using media, social media, traditional media, that those people who are there who need to write the memorandum to the minister who asks for an update, they have that information, and we are able to feed through to them, who frequently look for answers but don't have it, because we are a very closed circle. And I think we keep our research, we keep our information, and we keep our campaigns too close to our chest. So that would be my response, but it has been an incredible time. And I also want to know, if there is a minute left, whether we should ask Taku to come in here, because he was the one who for many years carried the SADC Basic Income Grant campaign.
Thank you, Isobel. I think let's allow Taku to also give some responses here and some of his ideas, particularly on the takeaways and the way forward. And then we can also ask someone from SADC to say a few words. But I will still ask you, Isobel, to sort of then wrap up right at the end and close this. And I hope I can do it in the next 5 minutes, if everyone allows me to do that. So Taku, maybe can we hear from you, your quick, sharp interjections? What would be your key takeaways, your issues and experience? Taku? Taku? Interjections, what would be your key?
Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right, apologies for that. I was actually tuning in via YouTube, so I had muted my Zoom. But I think it's quite important that, and I'm happy given that the fact that the campaign has been running for years, and up to now, we have come to a point where there's renewed energy on the rollout of a basic income grant. So in a way, COVID has actually done us pro basic income campaigners a good job, because then we have to now start renewing the interest and also looking at how things need to be done this way. We have ample experience, as already highlighted, on what went wrong, what needs to be done. And it's now an option moment for us to take this further and actually with renewed energy and passion, driven by the fact that it's not only the poor that need to be taken care of, but the multiplier effects from the economies, from the impact of this rollout of a basic income grant will immensely contribute to the development of all economies in SADC, and also reduce the vulnerabilities that we currently face. So going forward, obviously, from our perspective, we feel that the work needs to be continued. We need to continue with the work and just push to ensure that at national level implementation is done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taku. Christabel, I hope you're still with us. Would you like to share some? Thank you. Could you please share some closing remarks with really highlighting what are your key takeaways and your suggestions for the way forward?
Thank you. Just to say, this has been a really informative discussion and so many opportunities for collaboration. The Southern Africa Trust has really been working within some of the SADC spaces on various thematic areas, trying to push for this regional national linkages. How do we ensure what is adopted at a regional level is also implemented at a national level? So we see this work as an important opportunity for possible collaboration and working together. The Trust have a project around social protection, but really looking at the mining sector, where we have been working with Miners Association, trying to help them to access their unclaimed benefits, and have also worked with SADC in helping them develop. We did research and also helped in developing a policy framework to facilitate the cross-border portability of social security benefits, which will benefit not only the miners, but also migrants that are moving within from one country to another. So in those spaces, we probably do not touch so much around the basic income grant, but that will be an opportunity to say, when we are engaging in those spaces, can we bring this conversation and to say, how can countries begin to implement systems that facilitate the coverage of more people and ensure people have access to that? So I think there's so many opportunities for partnership and collaboration and inviting each other on different spaces so that we can continue to profile this issue. And I look forward to working with the different stakeholders on this platform and see whether there are possibilities of joint activities. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christabel. I think that's a very nice offer. We always like to then hold you right to that because your role in this to really inject the momentum again on the basic income grant would be really welcome. Isobel, I will allow you to then wrap up for us in closing remarks. What would be the key takeaways and the overall way forward that SPII would take beyond the webinar, beyond today's conversation? Did we finally lose Isobel to load shedding?
I think so, but she should be coming back.
We did.
2 minutes.
I think let's just stretch out a little bit and give her like 2-3 minutes. I'm sure she should be back. In the meantime, just stand on standby because I'm sure SPII would still love to have the last word on this.
I think while we wait on Isobel. Oh, she's back. Oh, okay, perfect.
Yeah. Isobel, welcome back. Can you unmute your mic?
Yes.
Thank you.
I was just saying how pleased I was that we get another 35 minutes of electricity. But I just want to, for this, the exciting thing, and I'm sorry, Christabel, that through the, we are also doing an informative research output to Namibia. So we're going to be having quite a deliberate capturing of their experience right now. From webinar, we'll go into an output report, which we'll use as the basis for a further regional advance of work starting next year. So we do want to see this continuing. And I think for me, it's really exciting seeing younger activists coming up, while some of us elders take a back seat on this. So I think the support for this, we have it on YouTube. Thank you for enabling this to take place and facilitate.
Thank you very much, Isobel. At some point, Taku had sort of said, oh, before Isobel comes back, I've got something to say. I don't know, Taku, if you still want to say something.
Not at all. I think I was just about to say that the work continues, so we'll definitely have a report on this. And to the panelists, we might be following up on certain specific questions that we'd like to ask for you to respond, especially given that there are some questions that might not have been answered in this particular platform. So please bear with us. We'll be calling on you to engage with us just one more time. But thank you so much for the time and the participation in taking this opportunity to air the experiences not within South Africa only, but across the region on such an important discussion. Thank you from myself. Over to you, Tendai. And thank you also for facilitating.
Okay. Okay, as the moderator, I would like to thank all the participants, all the panelists for their wonderful and strong input, all the partners and stakeholders that joined us this afternoon. We do look forward to a follow-up to the webinar. Please enjoy the rest of your afternoon and goodbye.